Hello, everybody. My name is Vivian Schiller. I'm with the Aspen Institute, and I'm here to welcome you to Not a Drill, Transitioning to a Low-Carbon World. I know this is going to be an absolutely fascinating conversation, and to lead that conversation, I am happy to turn it over to journalist and best-selling author of many books, Charles Duhigg. Over to you, Charles.
Thank you, Vivian. And thank you to all of you for coming today. This is such a treat to get a chance to talk about carbon and the world and where we're going. And hopefully this will be somewhat of a conversation with you. We're going to leave lots of time for questions, and we would encourage you to ask questions and to participate in this dialogue, because I don't think there's anything more important to actually encourage a dialogue around than how we confront the climate crisis that is literally happening in our own country as we speak. And we luckily have some wonderful panelists to help us think about this. And rather than introduce all of them, I'm just going to ask each of them to answer a question for me. Tom, let's start with you. Tom, you're the president and CEO of the Allstate Corporation. You've been doing that for 18 years? Is that
18 years.
18 years. So let me ask you, when we talk about decarbonization, when we talk about changing the trend lines, is that doable, in your opinion? And what would it take?
I think it's definitely doable. We are going to transition to a lower carbon economy because the market's moving. Like, it's going to go there. No matter what happens at this point, it's going to happen. But a couple of things I think people are not focused on, Charles, is one, it doesn't necessarily mean there's not going to be a lot of severe weather catastrophes. Mm-hmm. And so I think there is. And I think we could get there faster if we were better organized.
And I imagine that one of the risks that we have is we start making those changes, there's still weather catastrophes, and everyone says, well, why are we bothering to do all these changes? It's not working.
Yeah, and they're going to be with us for a long time. And I'm not really sure about the math, but we could talk about that later.
Okay. Yeah. Elaine, you have been working with the UN and other organizations for a long time. You were at
World Bank, World Economic Forum.
And you have been trying to drive change inside these big organizations for a while, and these organizations are one of our biggest opportunities, right? They touch so much of the world, and yet they are also bureaucracies that are hard to move. The same question to you, is this doable? What will it take, particularly when we're looking at these institutions, whether it be multinational or the federal government?
So thank you, everyone, for being here, for the interest. Yes, it is doable, but it requires a lot of political interest, not only from the government, but also from governments to work with corporates and also to take into consideration what people want from them. So this multi-stakeholder engagement and working together, driving the change and supporting the innovation that is available is very important.
And what does that mean? Because to bring many stakeholders to a table and get them to coordinate, there has to be an incentive for them to want to do that, right? What do those incentives look like? Like, what has worked in your practice over the last decade? What has actually worked?
Well, one of the important things right now is, I don't know who here was in the first meeting this morning, the $38 trillion question. And a lot has to do with the innovation and the corporations driving the changes and the solutions for a carbon transition. But in the end of the day, you need policy to change as well, and have countries' interests working together and not apart. So when we talk about the multi-side organizations, including the World Bank or other developing finance institutions or the United Nations system, you have almost 200 different countries' interests being discussed at the same time. And the interests are different. Yeah. So the idea of having a one solution fits all, that's very hard to achieve, but is doable.
Okay, good. And we're going to get more into how it's doable. Gernot, you're a climate economist at Columbia. You've spent a lot of time thinking about how do we price this issue? How do we use economic structures in order to encourage this in a marketplace? Let me ask you, the price of carbon is high, right? Is this doable? How do we economically, is it realistic to ask people to change their basic economic models to include the cost of carbon in a way that decreases the amount being released?
I hate to start with correcting you, but the price of carbon should be high. Right?
Right.
As in, I mean, it is high. The social cost we all pay, right, is enormous. When I bought a flight on the East Coast to come here, right, that's half a ton of CO2.
Yeah.
1 ton back and forth, and then, you know, the United app gives me a chance to spend $3.50 to make me feel good about flying. And I mean, okay, no surprise, right? But the only reason for that is to make me feel good about flying and do more of it, not to actually price the full social cost. Which, not to be the numbers guy here, but yeah, a couple $100 per ton of CO2. And that's the bare minimum, right? That's the stuff we can quantify. Those are the known knowns, the quantified quantifiables.
Yeah.
And of course, you know, as Allstate and Allianz and Almundi, and you know, those are just the A's, right? All know it's about the risk, it's about the uncertainty. It's about making sure that we insure ourselves against the stuff that could really hit the fan.
And let me ask you something about that, because a number of people here flew here, right, even if you live in Aspen, and it is wonderful to be able to fly across the country for $300, right? It makes it so easy. How do we make the pitch to people that actually it should be $450, it should be $400?
Well, you know, a comedian who may or may not have been on stage here yesterday said, right, it used to take us weeks and or years even to go across the country, right? You had kids, you got married and so on. Now you take a crap, you watch a movie and you're there. It's awesome, but, and I guess this is the but, right? So none of this is about, okay, let's ban flying. Thou shalt not, right? But pay for the damn damage you cause, right? So, okay, my ticket was, yeah, I don't know, $450 or something. $200 extra. That's a sizable matter. It is. And of course, the whole point of it is to do less, right? Now, okay, yes, that means we write the incentives here. We set the right incentives to make sure that we pay for the full damage and maybe think twice about flying across the country for, you know, the second cousin's bar mitzvah or whatever. You wanted an excuse to get out of that anyways, right? Carbon price might
You can say, I'd love to come, but carbon.
you know,
I'm going to use that all the time, actually.
That's a good idea.
That's a pretty good. Marianne, you are the CEO of Y Analytics, which is TPG's ESG unit. That's a lot of letters I just used. But you interface with companies and with investors who are thinking about how to invest with these issues in mind, both from trying to prevent bad things from happening, but also looking for opportunities. Let me ask you, is this doable? Like, are we looking at a brighter future?
We are looking at a brighter future, very simply. We need a lot more of it. We have pockets we need to pay a lot more attention to, as Tom said. But one of the most interesting things from where we sit with, fortunately, billions of dollars to invest in climate solutions is that the power of unit economics is working. So on the cost point that you were just describing, renewable energy at this point is one of the least costly types of energy in 90% of the world right now, for 90% of the population right now. 74% of the new generation capacity that's going in the global south right now is renewable. Not just because people think it's a really important thing to do for the planet, because unit economics have gotten us there over the past 2 decades. So there are so many things that are happening now that will allow us to get there. We just have to do a lot faster and a lot more of it. And there are some real pockets we should talk about that are not yet on that journey.
Okay, so let's talk about those. Let's talk about those pockets. What's the first pocket that we ought to be talking about?
Adaptive finance, adaptation.
Adaptation.
So this is the whole idea that this isn't a 2050 problem. 1,300 people died in the Hajj this past week because of heat. The floods in Brazil, which Elaine and I have talked a ton about. Things are happening now. So what are all the amazing adaptive finance type of mechanisms that we can be doing now to use the same creativity we've been putting in place for mitigation to actually help humans endure and thrive, and our economies thrive in the current changes? That's one big thing.
Okay, I want to talk a little bit more about that. Before I do, Elaine, I know that you have spent a lot of time looking at the actual victims of climate change, spending time visualizing what that looks like. We're seeing a touch of it in the US, we see it on the news, but from your perspective, who should we be thinking about when we're talking about these problems?
Yes, that's a very important question. So climate justice, climate equity, climate advocacy, along with gender and human rights, should be at mind when we discuss anything about a country. As Marianne was talking about, one example of a recent climate disaster that happened in Brazil in the end of April displaced about 600,000 people with floods, killed 170. 70,000 people don't have a home to go back, which create also the term climate refugee. And there are climate refugees across the globe. There are countries, because of rains and monsoon season, including China, India, Pakistan, the Philippines, Nigeria, where a lot of people end up having that situation, not only because of the climate that happens there, but it's getting worse and worse. And everybody suffers, because when you strain the conditions of water, fuel, anything that is available because of a disaster that happens, everybody suffers, but kids suffer the most.
You know, I agree with that, and I think there's two groups of people we're not, but there was something you said that I wanted to just put a little, and maybe you didn't mean it this way, but so I think it's going to happen. I think it should happen. We should decarbonize the economy, and I think it's going to be good. I think we're all going to make a whole bunch of money, and the world's going to be a lot more prosperous. So I'm totally in favor of it. But what I'm seeing happening now sometimes is people are taking the climate change stuff, and they're throwing other things on it, like gender equality and this other stuff. And I'm like, we're going to get confused. Like, let's just, like, those things need to be taken care of. They need to be addressed. But people are saying, like, so I think there are two parts, though, that we're not really focused on individual equity. And the first is the Southern Hemisphere. So if you think about who's going to drive this change, it's the US, Europe, China, and a little bit of Japan. Like, those are the four economies that got the money, the technology that are going to make this happen. It's not the Southern Hemisphere. Yet the Southern Hemisphere is going to it still has the same problem. So, like, who's going to take care of them? And I think right now nobody's talking about taking care of them. They're like, oh yeah, well, let's just hope they don't put coal-fired plants in and make worse what we fix. Like, that's kind of the general thing I hear. And I'm like, well, that doesn't seem fair to me. But when you get into climate change, people are so focused on the current stuff, they ignore the human rights issues. So if you look at cobalt mining in the Democratic Republic of Congo, they call it artisanal mining. It's really slave labor mining. Just happen to have got a good set of words on it called artisanal, and nobody cares. Yeah. We put EV subsidies in, we drive up the number of electric batteries we have, and there's more 12-year-old kids digging in mines without supports. So I'm worried about that part. I don't know, Lane, if you have a point, but it's like we will, the Northern Hemisphere, will work on this, but the Southern Hemisphere, nobody's looking to try to take care of them.
Marianne, you had something to say.
So I think the good news is people are starting to. And there's actually amazing entrepreneurs and solutions-oriented folks in the Global South who are saying, you know what, we can even do better, and we can leapfrog. And so I have been struck by, for example, the fact, I think I just mentioned, but the generation capacity that is going in the Global South right now is actually 74% renewable. That's actually fascinating to me. You couldn't have said that a decade ago. And I think part of the issue is, or maybe perhaps I'd ask, a finer point is, where's the money going to come from? So it's not so much that folks in the Global South don't either have the solutions, have the ingenuity, have the need, and the will. It's more, where's the money going to come from? And maybe that's what you're saying.
Well, yeah, and it's kind of, and Gernot might have a view on this. There's carbon credits, right? And you said I don't know, maybe they're $100, $200 a ton right now, which maybe they should be like 2,000. So I happen to be in Bhutan about 6-7 months ago. And Bhutan is, like, by constitution, 72% of it has to be forested. Like, you cannot cut it down. They sell carbon credits. The problem is people want to only pay for those carbon credits what the current marginal cost is to take out a ton of carbon, which is nothing because we're getting rid of stupid old coal plants.
Right.
When in fact, you should say to Bhutan, you know what? Like, we're going to pay you what it would be worth 15 years from now. And it wouldn't be that much money. So here's $2,000. And they'd have 10 times as much money. They could invest in the kind of stuff Mary Ann's talking about, but I don't know. We're not, like, you study this. I was talking to somebody there, and of course, my wife's like, could we just hike? Like why, but, like, why is it so messed up?
On trips. And
So maybe a couple of points. So one sort of the optimistic version, if you will, right? So I mean, this is sort of look, there are higher penetration rate for cell phones in some sub-Saharan African countries, Kenya, chief among them, of course, than in some European countries. Why? Because right, Bulgaria, Romania locked themselves into the landlines, the old infrastructure, after everybody else, and well, they are the poorest among the European countries and don't have as many cell phones per capita as the countries that never got the landline in the first place, right? And we basically see that, right? And frankly, one of the I don't know whether this is optimistic or pessimistic, but one of the sort of facts in this, in the low carbon transition is we're retiring very little fossil infrastructure as we speak. Yes, coal no longer pays for itself, but 90% of it is locked into long-term contracts of 20 plus years, and yet getting rid of those 210 remaining coal plants in this country is a problem, let alone China, right. India, Indonesia, and so on. So there's all of that, right? The other major finance point is, look, it might pay to put the solar panel in sub-Saharan Africa, closer to the tropics than in northern Germany, where the capacity factors are pretty low, because it turns out northern Germany is not a particularly sunny place, right? But the investor needs a 7% return on investment in Germany and 25% in Egypt. Right, because of this, all the normal reasons, right? Sovereign credit risks, right? Yeah. And the fact that the Democratic Republic of Congo is neither democratic nor a republic, right? Like, all that matters in this calculus, of course, right? Okay, so how do you get the billions necessary from where the money is, right? From, Aspen and Washington and New York and so on, to the places where the solar capacity factors are the highest.
And I want to talk more about that. Before I do, let me just ask the audience a question. How many folks in this room have bought a carbon credit or some other kind of offset in the past year? Okay, I'd say what, a little under half the crowd, yeah? And how many of you have spent more than $500 on an offset? Or, okay, fewer, but still a good number. So in essence, we have sort of, and this is a fairly enlightened group. I wouldn't expect the same thing if we were doing this at, say, a Trump rally, but I do think that it's interesting that only about half of us have, and you essentially bought something that you don't receive anything yourself for, but it's making the world a better place. Yes, go ahead.
Okay, so here's my follow-up question.
Yeah.
Did you purchase that credit? You considered climate change solved for the day, and you moved on? Or did you purchase this credit because you understand that, right, it takes a lot of money per ton of CO2 today to climb the learning curve, slide down the cost curve, and at the same time you're voting for all the right politicians who want the compliance market, to use the technical term, right, who want a carbon price by policy as opposed to the voluntary stuff that the United app gives you to offset your flight, right? Because honestly, it's all about, right, like none of this is enough. We know that, right? So of course it's always about what comes next. And that in many ways is the most important questions about any of the voluntary offsets, right? Any company, anyone who voluntarily does it, okay, do you do that to then move on and worry about different stuff? Or do you consider that to be the entry drug, right?
This is really interesting, because I think one of the things that we're saying is, how do we sell this? And the fact that over half the room hasn't bought one of these credits, I mean, you guys are interested enough in this topic that you came to this panel to listen to people talk about it. And I'm the same way. I get that thing from United. I don't pay the $3.50 because I think it's a scam. So how do we, and by the way, if we tell people, by the way, congratulations for buying a carbon credit, you didn't do enough because you stopped caring about it that day. That's a hard marketing sell.
So here's where it needs to go. So just the one
That's where it
second,
needs to
right?
go.
So, okay, Europe, turn up my European accent even more than I usually do. 50% of all emissions, $100, 75 euros right now, per ton of CO2, right? That's the stuff that drives decarbonization. Or, my fellow Austro-American who showed up with slightly more steroids in a suitcase when he came over, when he signed the law in California in place, right? By now, right, $35 or so per ton of CO2 for 85% of all emissions in the state of California, right? That's what drives the change, and not even that is.
But I think we're missing
enough.
something. As an economist, let me try this on you. I'm not sure it actually works. So we talked about guilt being a powerful thing. That's okay. I would say personal self-interest is more powerful than guilt.
Of course.
And I would say so, but you gave really three ways. So first, the government can make us do it, and they're doing some of that. The government can also incent people to do it, and we're doing some of that with EV stuff and that kind of stuff. And then you have, Marianne was talking about economic interest. Businesses can make more money, and the government is giving businesses so that we can make more money, so get around the 25% we have to get in Egypt or something like that. But what we haven't really done is figured out how to make this work for individual middle to low income consumers. And unless we do that, we're going to get what's happening in Europe today, which is people are pissed off because all this stuff costs more, and I'm not getting anything out of it, and my kids are going to be better in 20 years, and my health is going to be better. And they're like, look, the air is the cleanest it's ever been in the history of the world today. It is. I'm not feeling like I'm, in the middle of a rainstorm. So how do we, and I think there's got to be some way to give middle and low income people some sort of economic benefit. And I don't have the answer. The only one I can come up with is, I think the government is, in that bucket, is directing us to not do the best thing. Like EVs are good, but we're over-indexed on EVs. Like we don't need to spend that much money on EVs getting the carbon out. It's like they're way over-indexing. Food creates, 25%, Marianne will probably know, of all the beef we eat and all the other stuff we eat, 25% of the methane and other greenhouse gases that come out. Why don't we give people, individuals, money if they buy chicken instead of beef? I don't know, it's maybe a really dumb idea, but I just feel like we haven't done anything to mobilize those people who drive a lot of the behavior.
Yeah, I think we should bifurcate. The emissions decision-making, in many ways, is really concentrated in a very small number of industries, and many of them are very concentrated in a very small number of producers. Cement, aviation fuel, right?
Steel.
And so the idea that every one of us could do everything possible and it would make a difference on those issues, I think we should just keep in mind those issues need to be solved. And so one thing that I think is really important is not just thinking about clean electrons, but thinking about clean molecules and materials, and we can come back to that. On the individual behaviors, then, there are these areas where it is very distributed, whether it's because of the car you choose to buy, whether it's because the food you choose to eat, and those things are almost of a totally different nature and ilk. And to me, again, it comes down to the idea that we can't put the cart before the horse. We have to actually bring the unit economics along with it. And we saw what happened in Germany when the heat pump, there was a mandate that said there was going to be heat pumps were be required. And actually those cost curves are coming down really fast, but they're not yet at the point where it's as low as it needs to be. Whereas, if I remember correctly, you've just written a pretty interesting article about arguing about the China EVs, but there are products out there. We're invested in Tata EV right now in the Indian market. The EV markets outside of the US have very low-cost EVs available. So there's a lot that goes into this, I think, in terms of making sure that we don't put the cart before the horse on the mandates for individuals, and we keep getting those unit economics in place, whereas with the more concentrated areas of business-driven emissions, we can handle those differently.
And I hear a lot of overlap in what you guys are saying. Elaine, let me ask you, because you are working with countries that are those lower and middle class citizens, right? You're trying to convince countries. Costa Rica has been a model of convincing a population that doesn't have a lot of disposable income to embrace this. What is the key? What should we be doing to address this issue of bringing economics along, convincing people who it's not, that it's in their self-interest when they're not taking flights and they're not carrying?
Yeah, another data just to add to the Costa Rica example, as John Kerry said in the morning, that 48 countries in Africa represent 0.05% of emissions. And all of a sudden, when we think about Bhutan and the forests that they have, and nobody pays for the value of those forests, or all the islands around the globe, small island developing states that have all the oceans and life beyond, below oceans that nobody pays for, that the loss and damage that we are creating with our consumption in the Western Hemisphere. So there are countries that are being able to change a little bit on what he was speaking about, with example of Kenya, and the sellers, because the mobile phones, because they didn't have the landline before. It's easier to introduce a new technology or introduce a behavior change in the consumption if you didn't have the history or the legacy of something.
But I imagine the highest polluting nations are going to have that infrastructure in place. They're going to, they are the fully developed nations, and so how do we think about that?
A little bit on what Tom was saying, there should be more incentives for the population to change their behavior. Yeah. I don't know if it's giving you money for the chicken instead of beef that you're going to...
We don't own any chicken. We don't own any chicken farms. And we're short beef. No.
But there should be a way for a little bit of the empathy of as a consumer on the markets, on going beyond the EV that you are trying to create a market for, beyond the grocery and the pump prices that you're paying for your gas, that is beyond today, and you actually think about not only the generation 20 years from now, but 2 generations ahead of you, or 3 generations ahead of you, that we are talking much more than 1.5 centimeter.
And that brings us to electoral politics. Gernot, I know that you had something you wanted to say.
So yeah, maybe sort of putting 2 into the, right? So of course, right, benefits before costs, right? Sort of in the sense that, by now IKEA is selling $60 induction plates. Right? So used to be, right, the cheapest way to, boil your water was the contractor grade gas stove, $300 in like the student apartment or whatever, right? Now it's $60 at IKEA to do the same thing better.
Yeah.
With newer technology. And by the way, IKEA Switzerland sells solar panels and a thing called Solarvarme, one of these made up Swedish names, right? Heat pumps. You can go to IKEA and get heat pumps. Not globally yet, right? They're, first experimenting too, right? But we are climbing this learning curve so fast and sliding down the cost curve so quickly that, if you watch this 5 years from now, right, sort of most of our discussion will be, a bunch of fossils talking from way back when, because look how things have changed. And yes, it takes policy. And maybe just one more sentence on it, right? Incandescent light bulbs. Anyone remember those? It was the, lefty president, George W. Bush, who signed the Energy Independence Act of 2007, I believe, into law, which effectively banned incandescents. And yes, there was the Light Bulb Freedoms Act Michelle Bachmann introduced, and, of course, right, culture wars, I get it, right?
They marched on the Capitol.
But when Trump, of course, right, but when Trump tried to get rid of those standards, right, GE and Siemens and Philips and so on said, like, we are not selling these things. LEDs are fundamentally better products. They are cheaper overall. They're good for you as the consumer. They're good for everyone, good for the economy. There's no reason to get rid of this. The world has changed. Change is hard. I get it.
Okay,
but we are living through this change right now.
I want to move a little bit to politics. And before I do, let me just say, I would pay good money to see the instruction guide on building the heat pump that
IKEA. Don't miss a screw.
Yeah, it's a very big sort of one of those twisty things.
It might involve a contract.
Yeah. Okay, so a lot of what we're talking about is we're talking about creating incentives that are all rational, that work really, really well, but the thing that disrupts our rational progress forward is politics, particularly lately, right? We have seen a wave of conservative victories that are using the environment and the related issues as something they campaign against. And much of that compassion that we would have to have for lower income folks, at least in America, would be compassion for Trump voters, who many people in this room, I would imagine, don't have a lot of natural compassion for, or at least are disturbed by. How do we deal with this? Let's start outside of the US or US, worldwide. How do we deal with making this a political issue that brings us closer to less carbon, as opposed to making it a wedge issue that creates these huge fights that are going on?
One word, turn it into an economic issue.
So,
And I'm not a Biden campaign spokesperson, but Bidenomics, like, yeah, right? It's full on, right? Climate is the Inflation Reduction Act, right? It's about economics.
jobs. So there's a really fascinating piece that came out of in Bloomberg today, visualizing where the subsidies have gone from this administration. 161 billion have gone into Republican districts. 42 billion have gone into Democratic districts. Okay, jobs matter. Jobs, not just as a political tool, they matter to human thriving. And it's really important that we think about that. The other piece I would just say is that I had a crazy torts professor back in law school, 1L year. We didn't learn any torts law, but he said if you want to win with a jury in America, you have to tell them why it's good for America. And you're seeing some really interesting bipartisan-y kind of things start to come out that I don't know if they're good for world trade, but they are definitively putting an American spin, not just from Democrats, but also from Republicans, in a world that says, look, we're going to figure out a way to advance America's prosperity. And this is one of those ways.
Tom, you guys have customers in every single state and all over the world.
Yeah,
How do you see this issue?
So it's a good question, Charles. I'd go, let me go first national, then
Sure.
I'll go local, because I think there's an answer both. At national, I'd be making it about China. Okay, like China is going to beat us at this game because I'm a huge believer in the free market, huge believer in choice. You know, some people, I've been accused of being maniacally moderate by a friend of mine. So I think that but our way of doing this is disorganized. Okay, we get 3 great pieces of legislation, people are moving forward, but we got all these businesses doing different things, and it's not like we're not really well organized. So we could put more money into methane reduction than EVs, and we'd be better off. As a result of a disorganized free market approach, which I'm a big believer in, the United States has fallen behind. China has 70% of the photovoltaic solar panel business. They have 2/3 of the battery business because they operate as a centralized economy. They've been working on it for 10 years. They drive all their stuff there. We need something in between where we are, which is just create some incentives and throw it out there, and where they are, which won't work for us, and would be terrible for us. But there's something in between that is, like I was thinking about this morning. So we have John Kerry, I think, Senator Kerry has done a terrific job as a special envoy on climate around the world. Like, you look at how I'm pulling people together. I'm like, how about pulling us together here? Maybe we need a special envoy inside the United States to get us organized. So I think if we don't do that, we're going to lose to China. So I would help
like that
politics.
pitch. Okay, so local. How do we sell it on the local level?
Well, local would be about making it local and about your money. So, and somebody may want to go here at some point, but homeowners insurance is not always available in a bunch of places these days.
California, for instance, where I live.
Yes, and I'd be
it's an
happy
issue.
to talk about it. Not sell you a policy,
bring
but
your
I'm
business
happy to
card?
talk about it. But in the reason is not because of conservative politics. People don't believe in it. It has nothing to do with the right. It has everything to do with progressive politics of we want to control how much you charge to people. So while I agree with you on the national level, we've got that problem, I would say at the local state level, so it doesn't work in California, works fine in Texas.
That's
and
interesting.
Texas has more storms than Florida, more storms than California, and it works just fine.
That's really interesting. Okay, we're going to go to questions. Elaine, did you have something you wanted to add?
I just want to add something that the wave of conservatives across the globe, it is a fact that is impacting the more greeners and people that are more pro-climate. But I just want to remind people where we were 4 years ago. In June 4 years ago, we were probably, most of us, in lockdown. In 2 years after, when the countries started to open and business started to recover, kids were in school, there was an invasion in Ukraine. And in that 2 months after the invasion, we at the Joint SDG Fund, Sustainable Developing Goal Fund that I work, we receive requests of resources from 84 different countries, requesting resources to study the impact of the invasion in Ukraine on their prices for food, their prices for fuel and fertilizers. So 4 years ago, we were in lockdown. 2 years ago, or a little bit more than 2 years ago, the invasion in Ukraine started. And last year, October 7th happened. The world is upset. I mean, we are not in a good place. So the pendulum of how people are feeling, it is about economics, but it's also about the feeling of, what is my well-being compared to my neighbor.
Yeah, no, I agree. We have some mic runners, if you don't mind, because we're recording this and because we want people listening. Ma'am, right over here. Yeah, right? Yeah.
Hi, thank you.
And feel free to
Fascinating
introduce
conversation.
yourself and tell us where you're from, if you want to.
Okay. My name is Chiedo Wanko, and I am with Johns Hopkins SAIS. I just wanted to quickly reference the initial conversations between Tom and Elaine. And just to say that I think, going back perhaps to the framework of handling the issues first and then introducing its gender dynamics have proven to be deeply problematic and has opened up or widened the disparities. And so I think the current approach of bundling these issues together, looking at climate crisis, but also disaggregating the gendered implications has been productive, right, and moving us in the right direction. For example, Tom, you did rightly point out the fact that, we should look at climate and its human rights implications, right? We cannot look at human rights implications without looking at how they are deeply gendered. For example, if we're looking at climate shocks across Africa, looking at adaptations, and we have to look at the women who are more deeply affected and bring them into the conversations.
Sorry,
right?
This is a great point. I want to give them time to respond and get to some other questions, but thank you.
So I'll start maybe Elaine once. So I wasn't trying to say they're two totally separate things. They should be intertwined for sure when they should be intertwined. But what I find is sometimes people are taking two intertwined issues, could be gender, could be climate, and happy to talk about those. But when we stick something on that's not really related to that, what happens is it dilutes the effort. So you saw this with ESG. So ESG became pretty much what everybody decided it to be, and it fell under the weight of that, so people don't even like using the term ESG anymore. Even though I think it's really important, I think it's vital for business to do so. I'm only saying let's put them together when they should be together, but just from the chair I sit in, sometimes I see people tacking on other things to like legislation we're trying to do, and should be just separate legislation. Like people should debate that separately. I don't know if
Marianne or Elaine, either one, you actually oversee ESG.
Yeah, I mean, most of what we're doing is helping to invest in climate solutions and in impact companies as well, and do oversee ESG. So I couldn't agree more that there's been a pendulum swinging, and the pendulum swinging is never helpful. We all need to do the work and keep our eyes focused. There are issues where these are really integrated related on climate. And I would say that again, if I go back to, I think one of the biggest ideas right now would be to take all the collective imagination and energy that we've put to mitigation and start doing that for adaptation. It took us decades to get to $1 trillion of investment in climate mitigation. We're going to do that same amount, another trillion, the second trillion, in 4 years. We're at the earliest stages of thinking about really good adaptive finance, and that's where these issues come together. Okay. That's where these human issues come together.
Elaine, did you don't feel like
Yes, I have to disagree with Tom, and thank you for making the point again. It is important to have all aspects in everything that you do, either gender, human rights, and the climate advocacy, just because you don't have the ability to go back later for some of those things and in some of those countries. So it need to be built in every single program, in every single thing that you do. To go back later costs much more. So if you don't take into consideration the gender equality, or in business, for instance, countries that want to do the transition from one type of energy into renewables, the creation of jobs for women in that new industry is important because they are not there yet. So how you can make an incentive when a program is created it's not only important, but it's the change that we require for those the equity to come back.
Let's go to another question. Yeah, sir, or whoever's your close. Oh, sorry, I apologize. Sir, go ahead.
Hi, Matt Peterson, CEO of the LA Clean Tech Incubator, also board chair of Climate Mayors. Just a quick comment about EVs. Clearly, there's a debate in this country that I think has been a bit fueled by oil and gas, but there are some concerns about how we get the charging in place and the cars on the road, and with tariffs and protectionism, of course, making it hard for Chinese cheap EVs to get in this country, but we're trying to create jobs in this country. I just wanted to ask, you joked about California, given I'm from LA, I'm on the board of the Metropolitan Water District, where we think about climate and its impact on available water. Of course, a lot of our homes are built in wildfire-prone areas. What will it take, you think, for Allstate to get back into the market in a more way that we'd like to see?
Let me see if I can describe. I'm going to go way up for a second. I'm not trying to make you an insurance executive, but in insurance, our job is to move money around between people who have losses and those people who don't have losses. So in the homeowner business, about two-thirds, $2 out of $3 we take in, we give to somebody who has a loss. You don't have a loss at your house, we give it to somebody else. And so if we do that appropriately, we get a margin that's maybe 8%. The rest goes to expenses. If we don't do it appropriately, our customers lose, or our shareholders lose money. So when the state says you can't charge this person this amount of money because they're a high risk, and then I have two choices. I can either charge the customer at low risk more money, which isn't fair. So we want to be fair to our customers, and I'm not going to go charge a whole bunch of people who live in Iowa for people who live at in a fire zone in California. And so it's not fair to them. And then losing the money is not fair to our shareholders. So I think what you need is really what happens in Texas is the Department of Insurance looks at all the rates, they interact with, but in California, they don't even let us get back costs we spend. So until they agree to do something that's fair for our customers and for our shareholders, we won't be writing any more policies. I think that's really difficult to get through. I think what you're hearing now is a lot of people who are paying attention to it, but I don't think they have a solution. The other piece I would say is, we didn't really get to, this severe stuff's not going away. It's just, I've been around weather math most of my professional life, and the whole thing about 1.5 degrees and we're going to be fine, and we get this many gigatons of carbon out and all it's going to be fine. Nobody really knows, all right? The permafrost melts, whole bunch more methane coming up, nobody knows. So I'm we should just count on the world continuing to get warm, continuing to have a bunch of storms, they're going to be more severe, and we got to make sure you're safe, that your house can be protected, and we have to figure out how to do that. So I think there's a lot more work to do besides just transitioning the economy. We got to make sure people are safe. So I think there's a whole bunch of work to go there.
Yeah. Ma'am, yes.
Thank you. Thank you all for participating in this. It's very important. My name is Monica Mayotte. I am the former deputy mayor of the city of Boca Raton in Florida. And I've been a climate advocate and for, I don't know, almost 11 years. I was affiliated before I became an elected official with Citizens Climate Lobby. We lobby on Capitol Hill twice a year for federal climate change legislation. And I think their policy that they advocate for twice a year will help address what Mr. Wilson is talking about with how do we make solutions that don't affect the lower and middle income families. And their solution is called carbon fee and dividend. Carbon fee and dividend. And what that is the manufacturers that are pulling the coal out of the mines or getting the gas out of the earth pay a tax per metric ton of carbon that whatever they're extracting is responsible for. That it's collected by the government and then provide that tranche of money that's collected from these manufacturers then goes back to the citizens of America. Because you know that this tax that we're going to put on the manufacturers is going to raise the price of gas, fuel, heat, all that kind of stuff. And the refund back to the Americans is to help mitigate those increases in cost.
So let me ask, is this a good plan? Is this a solution?
I'm going to ask probably, he's more specific than that. I would just say it's an interesting concept. I think but we need to try interesting concepts like this, but we need a political structure so that we can try, and if it doesn't work, stop it. And the current political structure is not. So if you think about in World War II, we had the War Production Bureau or something like that, and they, in 3 years, turned our entire industrial complex into making weapons. That's too much. But if we had somebody at the federal government level who had some authority that would allow you to do these things and try it and then see it would work. Otherwise, you're going to just spend a whole bunch of time. I spent $20 million in 10 years trying to convince people in Washington that they should not wait for Florida to have a big catastrophe and then give them $50 billion. It was a waste of time. So I think we need something else. Gernot might have a better idea of the plan.
Okay, so it would be a fantastic idea. It is a fantastic idea. Where it works, British Columbia, for example, it works amazingly well. Not to make this too political, but what it also says, what it also shows, and right, so CCL, Citizens Climate Lobby, has been at this for decade and a half at least, right, advocating for this policy. It sort of puts a lie to the political rights argument that, oh, we can't do this because, oh, have you thought about the poor? Right? Because when there's an actual practical, practical is debatable, right? But when there's an actual policy like this on the table, then yes, the arguments are often, big government, tax, four-letter word, right? Can't talk about tax. These sorts of things. While at the same time, there is a, Econ 101 type policy that checks every box in the econ textbook, in the political economy textbook, right, like all these sorts of things. And there is, gazillions being spent lobbying against any of this, right? Because, it's not cap and trade, it's cap and tax. And, these sorts of things were, I was an economist at Environmental Defense Fund for almost a decade. Waxman Markey, Obama-era climate policy push for cap and trade. We were outspent to the tune of like 10 to 1 by fossil fuel interests. And that, of course, has continued.
Let me apologize for interrupting you. We're almost out of time. I want to give everyone just one chance. It's easy to walk away from these panels feeling really gloomy, right? Like there's a bunch of problems. But just real briefly, can each of you tell us, are you optimistic about the future? And just in one sentence, why? Tom, do you mind starting?
I think switching to a lower carbon economy is going to create a huge economic boom, and we're going to have so much prosperity that everybody will be really happy there. I think it's going to be bumpy along the way.
Yeah. Elaine?
I agree with Tom. for once. There is a great opportunity in all the solutions that are out there. There is people everywhere in every single country with solutions that are better than what we have right now, and the pace and the steepness of the curve for knowledge, it's amazing. So I am an optimist.
You're not?
Most expensive thing is not to act, right? Dozens of trillions of dollars. Acting, yeah, single-digit $1 trillion worth of costs. Well, cost is opportunity. So yes, of course, right? Economics, jobs, opportunity is what makes me optimistic.
The minister, Victoria Stafford, has a beautiful poem called The Gates of Hope, which says maybe not optimism, but hope is that piece of ground you stand on where you see the world as it is and as it could be. We're there. It is happening. We are making progress. We have so much more to do.
Well, thank you all for joining this panel. Thank you to you for coming and joining us today. I'm sorry we didn't get to more questions. I'm sure you can buttonhole these folks as we get off. Have a great festival.
Thank you, Charles.